Why your friends, network, and connections make for the worst podcast guest. Hey, my name is Alex Sanfilippo. What I'm about to share is really polar opposite of what most podcasting professionals would tell you. But I've got some proof here that I want to share to show you that what I'm saying is actually the truth and right. And I'm not undermining anybody by saying that. I think everyone's well-meaning by saying, oh, when you start a podcast and you're worried about where to get guests, start with your friends, start with your connections, start with people in your network that you're really comfortable with. Everyone says that to kind of just make you feel more comfortable, but I actually think it is some of the worst advice that you can get and take in podcasting. I'm going to share why. I'll start off by sharing why by doing a little practice here. Just pretend like you're listening to an episode of me talking to a guest, all right? That's what's happening right now. Man, we had so much fun hanging out last week. Oh, but we can't share that story on the podcast. Man, you remember that one thing that happened? Yeah, we're not allowed to talk about that here, though. Sorry, everybody, you can't hear that. Interject random word, followed by tons of laughter back and forth. Ha, oh man, that was good. Sorry, that's just my friend. They're super weird, but you all wouldn't understand that. Everything I just said is annoying. Like, there's no other way to say it. If you're listening to that, you're like, oh my goodness. Like, do you all want to stop recording and just go hang out by yourselves? Because clearly you don't care that anyone's going to listen to this. Here's the thing. That's exactly what I find happening when people are interviewing their friends, their family, anyone in their network, connections that they have some sort of familiarity with. Like if you're familiar together, you're going to have some synergy that seems weird to somebody who doesn't know you. And so I want to talk about those things because I think that the advice that we are given as podcasters and even as coaches, if you're listening, you're like a podcasting coach or quote unquote guru or somebody that trains people on podcasting, and you're telling people, start with your connections, start with your friends, start with your network, start with what you're familiar with. I think you're giving the worst possible advice. The most common thing that I find when I listen to podcast interviews, which I listen to different podcasts every day, always interview shows, the commonality among the worst content I hear is always somebody interviewing somebody they're really familiar with. Because this inside lingo shows up. This jargon that no one else understands shows up. The random interjected laughter, because clearly they have some weird synergy that none of us get, right? That shows up. That tells me as a listener, hey, you're not welcome here. You're allowed to listen, but don't get yourself involved. It builds this barrier between you and your listeners. So when the advice is from day one, start off by building a wall between you and your listeners, that's bad advice. A safe podcast is one that's established on trust, which tells your listeners, come here. Sit down with me and my guest. We're going to go through this together. None of us really know each other yet, but let's figure this thing out together, whatever that might be. The closer you are to somebody, typically the worse the interview and the conversation is going to go, because once again, they're going to bring in some lingo that really doesn't resonate with listeners and makes for a weird conversation that makes everyone feel like outcast. I'm repeating myself a little bit there, and here's the thing. You might be saying, well, Alex, I'm a professional. I've been doing this for years. I don't do that. Yeah, but is your guest a professional at that level? Your friend that you bring on, do they have the same expertise that you do? Probably not. And to test this, I went to some of the biggest podcasts in the world, like top 100 shows, some big names, like truly trained professionals, right? They have been doing this for longer than most of us have. And I listened to episodes where they had a family member, a close friend on, someone who's like really connected in their network. And they're always terrible interviews. And I'm not trying to be rude because, again, they're gifted, but their guests might not be. So they're going to throw in a random thing like, oh, you remember this? And like, oh, yeah, anyway, back on track here, right? And it's just weird for all of us to hear. Nobody really gets this right. Remembering, I'm not calling you out. I might be calling out your guest who doesn't have the experience, but it's somebody you like, so you bring them on. So my advice to you, first and foremost, is don't bring on friends, family, your network, your connections. Find new ones. Here's what you're missing out on if you say, oh, Alex, I'm just going to stick with it because it's what I know. Here's what you're missing out on. Podcasting is an opportunity to grow and expand your network, connections, and friend base. Listen, if your base isn't growing when you start podcasting, I'm telling you, you're probably missing big opportunities, and I think doing it wrong. And here's the thing, what you can do is when you bring somebody new in, you now have the opportunity, if you like them, you have good synergy, to introduce them to those that are already in your network, that are already your friends. You can bring them into your world, and now you have this expanding world. It's how you grow a network. Instead of saying, this is my treehouse of trust that I love, and we're just gonna all talk together, and listeners can listen if they want, right? You're expanding that, you're growing that, and doing that from day one, and letting people hear you get comfortable with it is the beauty of podcasting, and how you can really do well with this. So once again, I know this is against conventional wisdom in podcasting, but I'm telling you, this is the smarter approach to take. Now, a quick side note here. If you're like, Alex, I'm not going to listen to this. I am still going to interview my friends, my network, my connections, all that, right? Fine. But here's what's important that you need to do. If you want to, it's still not going to be great, but it can be okay. And here's how. You need to make sure that they know, hey, this is not for you. This is not for me. This is for the listeners. Get your inside out jokes right now before you record. You can tell me funny stuff. We can laugh back and forth. But when we record, we are not going to be those people. It's going to be strictly professional. We can have fun, but strictly professional from the regards of this is not for us. My best advice is pretend like you don't know each other. If you have to interview your friends, your network, all that, pretend like you don't know each other. That's the best advice I can give there. The better option now, what I want you to do instead is, again, expand your network. Go beyond who you know, because it makes for a much better conversation, because you can actually be curious. You can be listening instead of looking for times to interject inside jokes or share something that only you and that friend share in a weird way, right? Instead, it lets you expand that. It makes more connections. It breaks into someone else's network and combines bigger networks. There's a saying that many top-level leaders talk about, and they say that being a connector is the highest form of leadership. Be that connector for people. When you can do this, I'm telling you, you can really make powerful connections. So I'm going to give some practical ideas here. I got 4 things I'll share real quick here on how to find the right people to interview. First and foremost, the number one thing, and this kind of seems weird, is like one of my main points, you have to be willing to say no to the wrong ones. You have to be willing to say no to the wrong ones. Sometimes that's your connections. Sometimes that's your family. Sometimes that's your friends. I have some friends that would love to be on my podcast, and they have hounded me about it for years. I know it wouldn't be a good episode, so I say no. Sometimes there's people I don't know that are out of the network that come in. I know they're not a good fit. I say no. Here's why you can do that, and you need to do it with confidence, is because you do not know anything. You don't owe anything to any person who wants to be a guest. You only owe things and are responsible for your listeners. They're trusting you with their ears. That's your responsibility to take care of, which means you have to be that guard between them and the wrong information, the wrong people. So you have to be willing to say no. And here's the thing. I always say that every yes has to be protected by 1,000 no's. I say no to most people who try to get on my podcast, 90+% of people, because I just know that it's for a certain group of people, and my job is to serve them really well. So first and foremost, you got to get comfortable with saying no. It's tough. I get it. I'm a people pleaser. But we've got to be willing to do it. The next thing you hear is that the most niche person you can find, not the most famous, is typically going to be your best guest. So the person that fits a niche that you know, this is who I can serve. I'm curious on this conversation, like this topic. I want to have a conversation around it. I want to really dive into this. And they're typically not super famous. That's going to be a good conversation. I meet a lot of new podcasters like, fine, Alex, I want to interview my network. I need famous people only. All the time, because their thought is they'll share the episode and then it'll get a lot of views and it'll grow really fast, right? That's a flawed mindset that doesn't actually, first off, if they do share it, it doesn't grow your podcast. I've done this for a long time. I promise you, it doesn't make sense when you hear it, but it will not grow your podcast. And I don't mean to be rude, but it's not going to. So forget that. Why do you want to interview them if it's not going to grow your podcast? Are you a fan of theirs? Are you going to be weird if you interview someone that you're a fan of? Probably, right? Once again, putting your listeners on the outside. What's better than somebody who's famous is somebody who really knows a vertical or niche really well. And even if they're not experienced, sometimes not experienced is better. Because again, if you have that famous person on, they are media trained. They have sound bites. You can be like, hey, so tell me about this. And they will go answer the question a totally different way to move the conversation back to the direction they want it to go to fit the narrative that they've been trained to share. So it gets them the result that they want, not what you want. I know here's the inside scoop on why podcast interviews, even if the guest shares it who's famous, don't grow. It's because they shared the same thing on 10 podcasts right before yours. They don't remember your name. They don't remember your podcast. And that's fine. That's their objective, their goal. But when you find that perfect niche person that's not in your network, that you don't know, who maybe isn't even as polished or anything like that, but they know that topic so well that's going to resonate with your listeners and you're interested in it, that is a beautiful conversation. I have had top-level A-list people on my podcast, like super famous people. I have people that no one's ever heard of. The people that no one has ever heard of is always my biggest episodes. And really, if you look at any of the top podcasts, they all tell you the same thing. Oh yeah, this guest who you've never heard of is my most popular episode. And it's because it resonates with the listener. It lets them in. They feel like they're an insider in it. That's because you feel like an insider because you're learning with that person and you're inviting your listeners in. Number 3, that's a lot, sorry. Hope you can all take that in. Number 3 here is if your potential guest is not making an effort, don't have them on. What I mean is if it's a generic pitch, hey, I'd like to be on your podcast. They didn't put any effort in there. If it looks like they're doing like spray and pray method where they have like this generic pitch that they just send to everybody and hoping that someone will say yes, don't have them on. They're not worthy of your platform. You're the podcaster. You own the platform. You're not responsible for how they feel or what they get. It's totally up to you. If they're using some sort of AI pitch and you can tell, hey, this is clearly like AI jargon, If they're not even willing to have a conversation with you to get on your show, don't let them on. These are the people that you want to avoid. Whether they're in your network, out of your network, it doesn't matter. Avoid the people that are not putting in any effort. And the last thing I want to share here is have the people on there willing to invest in themselves. Who are the people that are willing to invest in themselves? The best example I can give of this is I run a company called PodMatch.com. It's a service that connects podcast guests and hosts for interviews. Not here to sell it. The only point me bringing it up is it's an all-paid platform. There's no trial. There is no free tier. Everyone pays to be in there. And that's because we want to build a premium network. Guests on there, I am very likely to have on my show because they've invested. They have said, my message is so worthwhile to me to get out into the world that I am willing to pay a monthly subscription to be part of a premium network where I can get it out into the world. If someone's like, I don't want to pay for it, I just want to talk on podcast, that immediately tells me, okay, you're not serious, right? And there's some people that are quote unquote multi-millionaires, like I can't afford your subscription. It's not expensive. It's very inexpensive. I'm like, okay, so then you're not telling the truth about where your financial status is. You want to talk about being a millionaire, but you're not willing to invest in yourself. Red flag, right? So for me, I'm not saying use PodMatch, but find those premium places where people are not just, hey, I want to get this for free. My message isn't worth $1 to me, but I want to get it out there to the world, right? You want to find the places where people are saying, I'm serious. I'm willing to invest because this message is so timely, so important, and I'm passionate to share it. Passion is typically followed by what our wallets do, right? We're passionate about things that we're willing to pay for, and we pay for things that we're passionate about. So keep that in mind along the way when you're thinking about who do I actually want to interview on my podcast. So hopefully that's some helpful things for you. Those are the 4 tips I have. If you're saying, Alex, you're right. I need to go beyond my friends, my family, my network, my connections, so I can have better interviews that serve listeners better. And these are my ideas around this. And I hope this really challenges your thinking. Again, if you're a podcast host and you've heard the advice, start with your connections, your friends, your family, all that, right? I think you need to go against that. It is very counterculture in podcasting, but as a listener myself and a long-term podcaster, I'm telling you, the better alternative is the people that you don't know. So again, I hope this really challenges you and hopefully adds value to you and makes your podcast get elevated so listeners have a better and better experience listening. Again, my name is Alex Sanfilippo, and thank you so much for checking this out.